So I see the real estate professionals have an opportunity to get back to work. Is that right, Brian? What I understand. So.
Yep. As of May 7th, construction and real estate activity reemerged from the remote work environment, which was good. We think that the allowances are reasonable and keep public health at the forefront. So.
That's great. Well, welcome everyone. This is our final session of the Michigan Lakes and Streams Association spring webinar. And we have been generously sponsored by the Glen Lake Association. So we appreciate their sponsorship and wish them a happy 75th anniversary. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm glad to hear that the sun is coming out again for this Memorial Day weekend. So happy Memorial Day weekend to everyone. This is a webinar, so everyone except the panelists are muted and you do not have video, so you can relax and enjoy. We are recording this session, so we encourage you to share it with anyone who might have missed out. And all of our sessions for this series have also been recorded. You can find them on our website, mymlsa.org. So mymlsa.org. We also have a YouTube channel, and you can find all of the videos there as well. The format today is different than the other webinars we've had. This is a panel. So if you have questions, we encourage you to please type them into the Q&A box. You will see that I also have the chat open. The reason I have the chat open is so that I could put some resources in there for you. So if you take a look at the chat, you will see contact information for our panelists as well as some other resources that are relevant to the discussion today. If you do have a question, like I said, please put it in the Q&A box. If you have a question that is specific for one of our panelists, please also put that panelist's name with the question so that I can direct it to the right person. And this will just be 1 hour. So at 3 o'clock we will end, and if there are further questions that we did not have a chance to get to, I encourage you to reach out to our panelists offline for those questions. And I do apologize in advance if we end up not being able to get to everyone's questions. Okay, without further ado, I will give you Dave Maturin, President of MLSA, who is going to introduce our panel today.
Well, thanks a lot, Melissa. Obviously today the topic is short-term rentals. It's an issue we heard about from several individuals who attended our 2019 annual conference at Crystal Mountain. We have the privilege today of having an outstanding panel of 4 individuals who have a great deal of knowledge on this important topic. Joining us today are State Representative Jason Shepard. He's in his 3rd term representing the citizens of the 56th House District. He hails from Temperance in Monroe County. He's a sponsor of House Bill 4046. He's the Chair of Government Operations, Vice Chair of Elections and Ethics, also serves on Financial Services and Transportation Committee. Next is John Nash. John is the Supervisor of Spring Lake Township near Grand Haven in West Michigan. His township is party to a court case. I think it's Rayum versus Township of Spring Lake, and they recently had an oral hearing before the Michigan Supreme Court on that case. Brian Westman is General Counsel for the Michigan Realtors, and they are in support of the legislation. Jennifer Rigderink is with the State and Local Affairs team of the Michigan Municipal League, and they oppose the legislation. So welcome to everyone. We hope to have a congenial discussion on the issues surrounding this important topic, short-term rentals. Each individual will be given an opening 5 minutes to tell us about the bill and their opinions on the issue. So we're going to go with Representative Shepard, and then Supervisor Nash, then Brian Western, then Jennifer Rigderink. And I think Representative Shepard is with us, I hope. I don't see his picture.
Yeah, I am.
He's with us.
Okay. Okay. So I'll turn it back over to Melissa for her moderator duties.
All right. I'm not going to be too exact on time, just about 5 minutes, and then I will monitor the questions. So if you have questions while you're listening, please go ahead and write them in the Q&A for our panelists. So Representative Shepherd, thank you for joining us. You can start.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for putting this together. I had the pleasure of serving with, I will always call him Representative Maturin. We came in together in the House of Representatives, and was always somebody that I considered a friend and a great colleague to work with. So I want to thank him for reaching out on this. This is obviously a topic that's been brought up. Actually started my first term in office. We've carried this bill over a couple of terms. The bottom line of the issue at hand is, for me, it's a simple one. The bill itself at its core just doesn't allow a complete banning of short-term rentals within a community. And, communities all across our state have different regulations, rules, or whatnot when it comes to rentals. And quite frankly, nothing that we're trying to do would stop the idea of, registering rentals, would stop the idea of using all of your current and existing type of ordinance language that would allow you to enforce. Some communities would go to a licensing type format where, that could be revoked if it's a constant violation on a short-term rental property. But for me, it's just the freedom of people that, own a second home and they want to cover their costs, whether it be the cost of mortgage and taxes and insurance, and they put them in the rental pools for the weeks that they may not be there. And I think that's an important, vital role in our state, especially when it comes to tourism and the things that we promote heavily with tourism and getting families here. And, family units coming to rent a spot. It's been going on for a very long time. And, now that there's a format for those to be listed more, globally, it became more of the forefront, obviously. But I just feel that personal property rights come into play here. And I feel that, there's ways that you can enforce your existing ordinances or your existing situations to be able to curb any potential shortfalls or problems that could occur with short-term rentals. That's basically my stance on this issue and why I've sponsored the bill. We've had work groups with the locals, MML, Michigan Association of Counties, and others to try to come up with some sort of compromises on how this legislation should look to try to get most everybody we can on board with the situation. And, those talks will continue and be ongoing until we come to some sort of place where we feel that it's comfortable balance between the personal rights of a property owner and some local municipalities having some sort of control over, making sure these aren't turned into complete commercial enterprises either. So that's basically the bottom line on that. Welcome questions and discussion today on this, and glad to be here.
All right, well, thank you, Representative Shepherd. All right, Supervisor Nash, if you would like to chime in.
All right, first of all, glad to be here, and I think the topic is very worthwhile. Short-term rentals are very complicated. It's not a simple issue at all. In Spring Lake, we took almost a year researching, having public hearings, talking to our attorney. It's really complicated to do it correctly. One of the things we find is it's definitely a local issue. The building blocks of your community are your neighborhoods. And if your neighborhoods are in a situation where you don't know who's going to be living beside you every week or every weekend, a lot of things are deteriorating. Now, that being said, we definitely have places in Spring Lake Township where short-term rentals are fully legal, and we don't discourage them at all. So I've heard of communities that say no short-term rentals anywhere. We didn't agree with that at all. I do believe every community should have a short-term rental agreement. And to do that, you're going to have to do a lot of listening. You're going to have to do a lot of collaborating, and you're going to have to do a lot of research if you want to have a good one. There's no one size fits all. Every community is a little different, and it's real important to get your citizens' input because it's going to take a lot of support, and there are different opinions. We're happy with ours. It's worked well. I think the reality of the whole thing, if you're talking about expensive waterfront property, which I think is the crux of the whole situation, when someone rents a waterfront property for a very large sum of money, they kind of get the idea that, hey, we spent a lot of money, we're here, let's have a lot of fun. The neighbors may not share that opinion. We had problems with probably 3 or 4 families. We have a lot of families that I can't even tell you whether they have short-term rentals or not, because they do exactly what they're supposed to. The other thing I would say is the fact that, yes, you can have rules, but they're very difficult to enforce. First of all, you have to have somebody tell you that there's somebody doing something improperly. You have to have the police presence to get to that area, and then you almost have to see the situation at hand. All those things sound real good that you can do them anywhere. I challenge any community to do that properly. So with that in mind, we're happy with our ordinance. It went through the appeals court, got a unanimous written decision. And as Dave said, we just had a hearing at the Michigan Supreme Court that we think went well, and I guess we'll have to see how that works. And thank you for giving me time, and if you have questions later on, I'll try to help you out.
All right, thank you very much. And I will remind everyone that in the chat you will find Representative Shepherd's bill and also the information about the Supreme Court hearings for Supervisor Nash's situation. So next we will have Brian Western from the Realtors. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Melissa. Thanks very much for having me. I think one of the things that I would add to Representative Shepherd's summation of the bill is one of the things that we've really struggled with as private property rights representatives and advocates at the Michigan Realtors is that there is no definition for what a short-term rental is. And obviously, for the last several years, the courts have weighed in, and we've sort of come to this distinction where anything less than a month is considered commercial activity. And for those people, myself included, who grew up not owning a second home or a property and going up for a week and renting, this is problematic. And 15, 16 years ago, when I first started with Michigan Realtors, it was not uncommon for us to be up in Torch Lake in Township and Acme, going to these meetings to talk about second homes and the importance of short-term rental rights, the viability of that market, but also the ability for people to recreate and experience those communities. So as Supervisor Nash says, it is a local issue, and we fully recognize that. But one thing that I do believe has been left out of a lot of these discussions is the voice of that second homeowner. And I understand that they may be there seasonally or they may be there periodically, but we felt that legislation defining what a short-term rental was and taking it out of zoning for the purposes of prohibition was the right direction to go in, because then it did redirect the local control aspect to police powers and making sure that discourteous behavior was dealt with on an individualized basis, as opposed to I guess I would say, presupposing that bad behavior is going to occur. As Supervisor Nash said, I understand that when people do rent these high-end properties or spend a lot of money in a community, there is possibly the scenario where they do not behave well. But there's also the scenario that they behave well and they also inject a significant amount of money into that economy. And our goal, I think, in supporting Representative Shepherd's bill and wanting to be at the table during this discussion to come to some sort of compromise is to figure out what the balance is to support the rights of second homeowners and also the ability for people to recreate and come to these communities in a way that is courteous and mindful of the people who live there full time. So that's probably where we're at on the bill. But the other thing I would add on this point is, as we go forward, obviously we're dealing with significant uncertainty right now with COVID-19, and quite frankly, the short-term rentals have been at the center of that as well, because prohibitions have been placed on the rental of those properties unless they're for frontline personnel, which is understandable at this point. But I do think that in the next few months, we're going to start to see a situation with some of these homeowners where they've missed out on an entire summer of rental income. And that's going to impact their bottom line and their ability to actually own those properties and pay those property taxes. So we would like to see a solution that balances the private property rights, fully understanding that there's two sides to this coin. We represent property owners, not just second homeowners. So the idea that a person has to live next to somebody that has a party house next door is not acceptable to us either. We do believe that there are tools in place, and we do believe that there are standards out there nationally to follow, ordinance-wise and state legislation-wise, that give locals the tools that they need to enforce. We don't think the best policy on this front is to suppose bad behavior is going to happen and therefore eliminate it through a ban, calling it a commercial activity, and therefore prohibit it in a residential zone. I know there are communities out there that have embraced short-term rentals and come up with a very thoughtful plan. I just think that right now we do need some statewide overlay on definitions and making sure that zoning is not the most expedient way to take away somebody's private property rights.
All right, well, thank you, Brian. We appreciate your comments. And we have our final panelist, Jennifer Rigderink. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Melissa. I'll just add to what Supervisor Nash said a little bit and echo his comments about, one size not fitting all. And having a statewide solution for when our communities are so differently. We have many, many communities who are not regulating short-term rentals, nor do they want to regulate short-term rentals because it's not an issue in their community. Most municipalities are taking up this issue and putting regulations in place because they're reacting to their citizens who have brought an issue forward to them. And yes, private property rights. The complicated issue here is that the second homeowner or the private property, the owner of the property wanting to rent on a short-term rental basis is right next door to full-time property owners who have the same property rights. So how do you best balance in that situation to try to find a happy medium? And the league feels that local government is in the best position to kind of do that delicate dance. And I mean, that's what zoning is all about. It's supposed to help protect property values as well as be a balance, try to mitigate nuisances between property owners. And, unfortunately, we see this issue getting even more complicated now in the midst of this pandemic because we think there's going to be a higher demand for affordable housing and workforce housing, which in some of our communities across the state was already a big issue. That long-term rental housing for retail and restaurant workers who are cash strapped, that's going to take a little bit longer for those economies to come back. And then, so how do short-term rentals play into that, taking long-term rentals off the market? And then again, those impacts on your traditional neighborhoods. It's one thing when we're talking about second homes on or cabins on lakes where traditionally that's where people are going for vacation versus your traditional neighborhoods that are possibly on a lake, but might be within walking distance or biking distance to a water source. And so how do we make sure to minimize those nuisances again? Because if people are trying to, going forward, are working with less money, they might be inviting more people with them now to kind of individually make those costs less. So you maybe see more people trying to, invite other folks on vacation with them that normally in the past they wouldn't have. And then my last point would just be that our municipalities were cash strapped before this pandemic hit. And so how do we look at, when it comes to being able to enforce nuisances? Our local police right now, they're not running out for noise violations. They're dealing with other things, again, before COVID happened, and we're looking at major budget shortfalls this fiscal year and into the next few. And so we already have cities that are laying off law enforcement. And so how does that all play into this situation when we're trying to find kind of that delicate balance to private property rights on both ends and moving this issue forward?
All right, well, thank you all for your comments. Appreciate that. And we do have a few questions in the Q&A. If anyone else has any questions they think of, please feel free to write some things down. So we have a couple of questions here. All right, so a couple of them have been dismissed. All right, let's see here. I have a question here for Representative Shepherd. It says that you mentioned preventing townships from imposing complete bans on short-term rentals, but in reality, relatively few townships ban short-term rentals across all zoning districts. By far, most townships with short-term rentals rental limits only limit short-term rentals to the more commercial districts while protecting the R1 type districts. What's wrong with a township having the discretion to decide for themselves which part of the township is most appropriate for short-term rental? Does your bill require all districts within a township to have short-term rentals?
So what it would do is this goes into the zoning where you cannot zone out an area for short-term rentals. And the best answer to that question is simple. If you have a limit of how many, there's nothing, I think there's a little confusion as to what the bill does. If you read it, it's basically a paragraph. And we left it broad on purpose. Where this gets tripped up is somewhere that I have an issue with. Let's say I have a neighborhood that for 20 years, there's been a handful of people that have short-term rented their properties. And a new city council, a new township group gets elected and decides, well, we don't want that area to be it anymore. We're going to move it over here. And now you have property owners that have done, probably most people don't even know their short-term rentals there, because you gotta remember, the people that own these properties, it's their asset as well. They're not just gonna let it go to where, it completely gets trashed and there's just constant parties and everything else that goes on, because we hear the doom and gloom. Well, I can say doom and gloom to my neighbors who had teenagers that threw parties every single weekend that I had to deal with, and they own the house next to me without any recourse for me to do anything. At least if it was a rental property with some sort of licensing or some sort of approval to do it, they could revoke that. But if it's your own neighbor, you can't do anything about it at that point. So I guess what I'm getting at is we're looking at the opportunities for municipalities if they want to limit the number of them. What could that cap look like? If they want to create the licensing aspect of the use of the property for that, let that happen. I'm in a complete disagreement that it's considered a commercial activity. And I say that because for me, it's a private residence, it's zoned R1. And if you allow zoning to be the strictest way to police these short-term rentals, then there'd be no residential neighborhoods that would be allowed to have it, because under the zoning code, it would still be zoned residential, unless you're going to spot zone one house commercial to allow it in the middle of a residential neighborhood. So my thought on it is, instead of dealing with it zoning wise, deal with it the other way. Deal with it on, number of them, have applications, have licensing fees. We talk about revenue to the local municipality as well. If it's a second home, you're paying the full freight. It's not like you're paying a homestead exemption on anything. The people that own those properties are paying twice the property taxes as probably the people next to them that live there full time. They're also, if there's some sort of fee to be registered within that municipality to do short-term rentals, there's fees that can be collected that way as well. So from my standpoint, I just think that going through the zoning process is the easiest way to completely ban it, just because their actual ordinance doesn't say we're not allowed. But if you make the zoning so complex to even get approval to do it, you've essentially banned the use of short-term rentals. And that's what I'm getting at. It's, you got to make it to where this market can grow. And quite frankly, that's what it is. Certain neighborhoods are not going to be onslaught with short-term rentals because there'd be no market for them. And it's no different than supply and demand of anything. So that's the difference that, we're trying to navigate, and why the state needs to have something to say about it in regards to zoning, because that's a state issue. Because if you remember, the states create the local municipalities. So there's certain things that we can do. And at that point, if the locals want to police them or find ways to have a balance, they can do that, just not through zoning. And that's where the real fight comes in, is the zoning issue.
All right, did anyone else want to weigh in on that question? I know it was directed to Representative Shepherd, but if anyone else would like to. Jennifer, I thought I saw your hand.
Yeah, I would just add, the way the league is interpreting the bill as it is in its current form is that it doesn't allow a community to say we can do short-term rentals in R3 and R4, but we're not going to do them in R1. And so we do view it as a kind of an all or nothing, at least in its current format. And I think that's where we have a difference of opinion on interpretation of what is a ban versus what is regulating. We feel that if local governments are allowing their short-term rentals in some of their R districts, but maybe not every single R district, that's a regulation. That's not an outright ban of short-term rentals in their communities. And again, it comes back to locals knowing their communities and kind of those tipping points. There is the way of, if somebody was doing something previously and it was fully allowed, when an ordinance is changed, the grandfathering in of those, if it's just a few and they weren't bothering anyone in the first place, a municipality would probably just grandfather those in, and legally they may have to just grandfather those in because they're changing a use. Somebody's using something that was completely legal before the ordinance was changed. And so I think that just comes back again into the statewide one size fits all versus the individual communities being best able to attack this.
Okay, Brian, yeah, I saw that you wanted to weigh in as well.
And I would just reiterate that, this bill is a short bill, and it has been subject to work groups. And the goal, I think, is to find some common ground. One of the things Jen said that we're dealing with right now is this idea of non-conforming use. And since many communities that have allowed short-term rentals to exist for generations have never had an ordinance on point, you don't have that argument. It's more of a reinterpretation of zoning law, which doesn't have the same weight of preserving a vested interest. And that's one of the main concerns that we have with approaching this through zoning, is that unless you have a way to preserve that longstanding right and practice, you're going to end up losing those second home rights and the ability to rent responsibly. And I understand, looking at some of these questions, that behavior is a big issue, and also the ability to enforce. I will tell you that irrespective of whether a law gets passed allowing for short-term rentals are going to occur in these communities. They will be underground, and oftentimes they will be pursuant to agreements that don't benefit anybody. And our biggest concern is that, we've never had an environment like today where short-term rentals are more visible and more easily tracked, and quite frankly, more easily enforced. And whether you have one person or three people in a community that handle enforcement, of these matters, I do think that it is the responsibility of the local government to balance the rights of the full-time resident and the part-time resident. And I understand that that's not necessarily a popular opinion sometimes, but as one of the questions asks, well, what happens, for the second homeowner who also has a primary residence? Would they want a person next to them renting? I think the answer, and I will speak for myself, is that there is a responsibility to preserve courteous behavior by all residents, whether they're full-time or part-time. And as Representative Shepherd said, we do have situations that get highlighted as bad behavior and a party house, but those types of situations are not uncommon for full-time, and the same type of recourse is available there as it is for a full-time resident. And that's why we want to have some sort of statewide overlay that defines what a short-term rental is, make sure that it pushes away from zoning as the quickest deterrent, and allows for police powers and housing code to prevail to make sure that not only are the properties safe, but they're also well managed, and that the property owner is responsible and accountable. So that's kind of where our collective association's been on this issue. But at the same time, this is a short bill, and we have been work grouping it. And I know Jen's put a lot of good faith effort into it as well, just to try and find that common ground. Right now, the zoning piece is a big part of it, though. So we hope these discussions continue on into the future. And as the summer months approach, people want to recreate in these communities.
All right. Yes, of course. I saw you, John. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, well, a couple of things. Obviously, I live on the lake, and I know a lot of realtors. I've been in our area for a long time. Realtors are calling me. What do I tell this person that wants to purchase the property with the sole purpose of making a short-term rental? I think that defies a lot of this discussion about the house has been in the family forever, et cetera, et cetera. And in Spring Lake Township, we have what we call a cottage district with smaller homes that have always been rented, and they're still short-term rental permissible. And like Jennifer said, please tell me just one community that can adequately enforce short-term rental rules. It's very, very difficult. Now, listening to Brian and Jason, I got to tell you, there's people in Spring Lake Township that I know rent short-term that we never hear anything about. And we don't have a bloodhound, and we don't go looking on the internet to find out who's renting and who's not. But if you're in an area, an R1 area, where the people that are investing, residents, have spent a lot of money, they don't care about having people next door to them that are there for a week or there for a weekend. I can tell you the best story. Our treasurer, his family has been in our fire department for 55 years. His son's a good kid. His son went to Torch Lake, rented a house on Torch Lake, and invited 30 of his friends. That's the way it is. And I guarantee you, if according to Jason and Brian, somebody rents something and we don't hear any problems, we're not going to go knocking on the door. We're not looking for problems. We're trying to maintain stability in neighborhoods.
All right. So I think everyone actually has weighed in on that question. So I will move on to another one. And I think, Brian, you already hit on this a little bit. And it's good that you're checking out the questions there. So there was an enforcement question for Representative Shepherd and for Brian. What about remote townships with limited law enforcement that make enforcement of short-term rental violations unrealistic? So this particular attendee says that their township only has one officer for a large township. There's just no way that that one officer can be called out for every loud short-term rental party at night. Why can't our township have the discretion to decide what is best for us? why do wilderness townships have to get treated the same as more populated townships? And they're saying that they don't think one size fits all.
So I'll go to that a little bit. The one size fits all approach is what exactly I said the bill doesn't do. All it does is not ban the use of it. The local municipalities would have a lot of leverage to figure it out. As far as the law enforcement issue, how do you solve the law enforcement when there's other sorts of violations if you're in an area that can't do law enforcement? I mean, to blame short-term rentals for all your law enforcement problems is pretty short-sighted. And I say that because you're going to have law enforcement problems if you have one officer for whatever township, even if it's rural. And you may have short-term rentals going on right now that have been going on for 20 years that you never even realize that they are renting the houses because they've never caused a problem. So I think that the alarmist attitude about it is a little disheartening, especially for property owners. And I say that because your neighbor could be loud. You could have a blight issue across the street that you can't enforce. And that residence owns it, lives there. It's their primary residence. They're homesteaded. And you could go through court violations year after year after year after year. If you have a small township or you have a municipality that you want to have some sort of registration for short-term rentals, and you have guidelines for it and licensing for it, and you give out the permits to allow it, okay, then there's your enforcement. And that's the part that's so simple, is you can enforce them. It's just you can't outright ban them through zoning. And even the example that was said by the supervisor, where people have been doing this for 20 years, we don't hear anything of them, we're not going to go in there. Yeah, that's great. Then why not allow that same thing to happen for other residents in that community if they want to rent out their houses? Give everyone the chance to do it. I don't see why that's such a bad thing at the end of the day. And that's what the crux of this thing is this is personal property, private property rights. If you don't want to have it be solely for that purpose, you could, within your licensing, have some sort of, occupancy restrictions based upon number of bedrooms. All that stuff can be in there. Nothing's banning you from doing that. All this bill does is not allow it to be banned through a zoning process and calling it a commercial use, which I don't believe that it is.
Brian, I believe they were directing that toward you too, so I would give you a chance. I mean, you sort of addressed this a little bit, but just in case you.
I mean, I think that enforcement is always going to be an issue, and we see this nationwide. This isn't a Michigan-centric or lakeshore concept. It's just the ability, I think, for a sea change to occur, which is, in order to find that balance where you do properly balance the rights of the second homeowner, you have to figure out a way to come up with whether it's a licensing protocol or the ability to set up short-term rentals in a way that is out in the light. And I know that a couple of the comments on the board here suggest again that these communities that don't have a problem with short-term rentals, they don't want to have to regulate, and they won't regulate. Those are also the same communities that decades ago decided to start characterizing it as a commercial activity in a residential zone, and therefore, even though it had occurred for generations, was now not allowed. That's sort of the area that I think zoning continues to be most important. I think as we discuss short-term rentals and the future of short-term rentals, so long as there isn't an adequate balance for allowing the right to persist and then addressing the behaviors thereafter through licensing, through inspection protocols, and making sure that the properties are well maintained and up to code. Those are all elements that we think are extremely important to this discussion. And I think that enforcement also enters that discussion, and it's also going to be benefited from all of those things, because a community that has a market for short-term rentals will also have the ability to benefit from a licensing fee or inspection fee to be able to pay for those enforcement individuals or full-time employees. So we recognize that those inadequacies exist in communities that have one person that's handling full boat of all of their compliance. But as Representative Shepherd said, these are still issues that are not germane just to short-term rentals. I mean, you have bad behavior by the full-time resident, you have parties, you have noise violations, and all of the nuisance aspects of the current lay of the land exist. I mean, if you have an occupancy violation, as Supervisor Nash said, where someone jams 30 people into a house, that's an occupancy issue. It should be addressed, and I would say addressed before the party gets out of hand, because that's a health and safety risk without a doubt. Do those things occur? Yes, they occur on short-term rentals and they occur on homesteaded properties. So we're mindful of this. We know it's the case, and as I mentioned, we want to be able to balance the rights of that full-time property owner as well as the person who owns a property seasonally, because otherwise we do have to look long-term here at the viability of the second home market. And Michigan is a state that relies heavily on it. And I don't want to have too much of a knee-jerk reaction to the fact that short-term rentals have become so pervasive now because of the internet. I don't think our enforcement ability has caught up to it yet.
All right, it looks like, yes, go ahead, John Nash, you can speak.
I keep hearing the bad neighbor issue. I live on a private road, and I think anybody in the panel or watching this can relate to the fact that if there's 12 neighbors on my road and there's one that for whatever reason violates what other people on the road feel is normal, acceptable behavior, and they're there all the time, the neighbor will solve the issue. This is not the same as when somebody comes in on a weekend that you don't know and they're gone, or maybe for a week and they're gone. You build no rapport with them. They have no responsibility for the building block of the neighborhood. Again, I say, we allow short-term rentals, but we just don't allow them anywhere. And like Brian said, the internet has changed the whole landscape of this. And with people purchasing homes to rent, and like Jennifer said, we have people in our area that used to rent on a long-term basis, which was nice for lower income people. And they've said, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. I can make way more money with short-term rentals. So I understand and appreciate you can what if it forever, but I think the biggest two things in my mind are the neighborhoods, the building block of the community, and it's a local issue.
Jennifer, did you want to speak?
Yeah, I would just echo what Supervisor Nash said. I was just going to say, I mean, to boil this down, that this is just a nuisance and enforcement issue is not realistic. I mean, we are talking about affordability issues and long-term rental units being taken off the market in areas that need workforce housing, where there are jobs available and there's not housing available for people to live close to their jobs. And again, the breakdown of the traditional neighborhood. Yes, somebody, if they are fortunate enough to buy a second home, they still have somebody next door who maybe spent their life savings on their permanent home. And so how do you balance, again, the person with the second home who needs to rent it out to make some money to pay their taxes versus the person who lives next door has to get up and go to work, and every week or every weekend there are new people next door. And so yes, they're loud one weekend, they complain, and the police come. Maybe the next weekend there's a whole new group in there. And so boiling it down to the enforcement, yes, it'd be great if all of our municipalities could set up a registration and licensing program and enforce then that program. That is just not realistic in today's world with, and our municipalities are disproportionately affected by this if they are by water versus if you're the city of Jackson, people are not coming there to do short-term vacation rentals.
All right. Okay, so we had some other comments. Some of them, I feel like they've been addressed. So we will, I'm trying to move on to some things that maybe have not been addressed yet. Okay, so one of them is about real estate wanting to be the voice of second homeowners. So I think that might be directed toward you, Brian.
Yeah, I think I addressed that already.
Oh, you did. Okay. Okay, great.
But I would say, one thing that Jen had mentioned that I think is equally important is you know, the idea of communities that are grappling with workforce housing issues and affordability issues, you know, we certainly haven't closed the door on discussions as it relates to, you know, figuring out what the proper threshold is for short-term rentals in a community that is grappling with affordability issues. We also think that, you know, communities have significant tools to work with developers to develop those types of properties that would go to suit affordability issues. You know, one of the few bills that MML and the Realtors were on the same page a couple of sessions back allowed for those types of agreements to take place, and we certainly support that, and we think that that type of cooperative work will address that situation. But anecdotally, I think we do have to get to the heart of, you know, what those thresholds are. And I know that, you know, Jen and the league and the Realtors and townships have talked about this, but we've never really figured out what that threshold is, or what that percentage of short-term rentals of the housing stock in a community should be. It's definitely a worthy discussion to continue to have, because I think it gets at the heart of balancing a lot of the things we've talked about in this panel.
Okay. We did have another question here about the bill. It says your bill got a hearing in committee in 2019. What do you see happening to the remainder of this session? And that's for Representative Shepherd, obviously.
Yeah, so I had a hearing. We made a substitute to it. Again, the situation's been where we work grouped it. The local groups and realtors and others are trying to figure out what provisions could be made to make the bill palatable for everybody. And some of the discussions, as we talked about, was thresholds, as Brian mentioned. That would solve a lot of the issues of every house turning into XYZ. And as far as, you know, municipalities not being able to be feasible to license anything, I've really rarely ran into a municipality in my travels as a commercial real estate agent that doesn't have some sort of a mechanism for whether it be permits or licensing within them. So I think that, you know, the majority of what we're talking about would have the means or sophistication or setup to do some sort of a licensing for it, to be able to track it through a registration. I personally don't want to create a statewide, here is your ordinance, here's what you have to follow. And I know that there's some that, you know, think that that's what we're doing. I don't want that, because for me, if you want to talk about thresholds, I look at it as a percentage of the housing stock that's in the community. And quite frankly, once all those short-term rental licenses are taken, no new ones can be issued. And I know some communities have a limit on how many of those short-term permits are allowed in a community. And some of them have not even reached the threshold that they set on themselves, because again, the sky is falling attitudes that everything's going to be short-term rental. And the reality of it is it's only going to be as much as there's demand for it. And there's only going to be so many of them in a community based upon how many can be rented. So that would be my take on that. But as far as the bill goes, we're hopeful to have some sort of resolution and movement before the session is done. If for some reason we conclude this year and it still isn't, I know 100% I'll be back next year, even when I'm not in the legislature as a state rep, because this is an issue that's not going to go away until there's resolution to it.
All right, anyone else want to weigh in on that? Go ahead, Supervisor Nash.
Yes, the one thing I would say is that, and I've told other people because I'm pretty active in the MTA, this is a state zoning type thing. And if this bill passes, I can't personally see why other bills that would come to the legislature, I think we all know there's quite a bit of campaign finance nowadays. And if one bill at the state level is able to circumvent local zoning, then there's a lot of other issues that commercial people might see as an advantage by changing the local rules. And I think that's a factor to be considered.
Melissa, I also wanted to mention that I think some of the folks on the webinar might be interested in is the league worked with the Michigan Restaurant and Lodging Association, and there is another bill package out there looking at regulating short-term rentals. It's House Bill 4554 through 4563. It's by no means, it needs work. But it is an alternative that was introduced that looks at a statewide registration system, and then taxing short-term rentals like traditional lodging is taxed. And you know, there's another thing we haven't talked or explored, and it's going to be very difficult to explore this now going forward, but even looking at a local bed tax that would help municipalities if they are facing some funding issues to do enforcement of short-term rentals. So there are a lot of other things out there to keep these discussions moving. The league has been very appreciative to Representative Shepherd and the realtors and being at the table to have these discussions. And we continue to be committed to be at that table to try to find a middle ground that doesn't make, you know, everybody doesn't get their way, but everybody gets a little of something, and it's workable.
The only thing I want to add is I'm fully supportive of having them be taxed the same. That's something that I think we can all agree on, that even the even the groups like Airbnb and others have said that that's not anything that's a deal breaker for them either. So I do think that to me is fine on that front. And I do appreciate the collaboration on coming up with some ideas to move it forward, because I think another thing we can agree on is it's not going to go away. It's a matter of figuring out what works for everybody. And I've always learned negotiation, when two people leave the table a little bit angry, that means we have a good bill. If one person leaves ecstatic and the other one leaves ready to kick the wall, that means we made a problem somewhere.
All right, so let's see. There is one point that I thought was interesting about the lakes themselves. A concern from one of our attendees about possibly, you know, and what this question is getting at is the spread of aquatic invasive species from these short-term rentals on lakes. And so then that would be a specific lake question. This is not directed toward anyone, but I didn't know if anybody, you know, had any thoughts on that. This is a lake and stream group, so those are our concerns.
Is the concern obviously when people are bringing their boats into different areas and putting the boats in, obviously that could possibly bring in an invasive species? Is that the idea? Yeah. I mean, I think that's certainly interesting, and I think that probably that question is not something that's exacerbated necessarily by short-term rentals, but by the transient nature of people recreating in Michigan. I mean, it doesn't need to be an overnight. It's just a matter of I'm taking my boat where I can put it in. So I do think it's an interesting question, and obviously we've seen we've seen that all over the state. We've even seen that as recently in dealing with the Midland crisis and water levels up there. So it's a tricky one, but I don't necessarily think it's one that's attributable to short-term rentals. I think addressing it is probably more about responsibility and people making sure that they're maintaining their watercraft.
Yes, Representative Nash.
One of the things that I would say with our deliberation on short-term rentals was early on in the process, we tried and successfully, I believe, told participants that the extreme what ifs were just that, extreme what ifs. And if we tried to deal with every extreme what if, we would never get anywhere. And I concur with Brian. It might happen, but there's so many other ways that, you know, these possible things that we don't on the lake could be transferred. That's a pretty remote what if. I mean, I would hate to see it happen. We've had some issues here in Spring Lake, but I really think if you're going to deal with the issues, you want to keep the major ones out in front of you, because lots of remote what ifs make it confusing.
All right. I think there's a question, or see, I'm trying to parse through the questions and the comments here. Okay, so here's a question. It says, anyone on the panel? It says, you stress that folks should have the property right to raise money to help pay expenses for the short-term rental property, and therefore this bill is necessary to preserve that right. But using this logic, couldn't this logic be equally applied to any activity designed to raise money? For example, is there a right to use an R1 property to have a dog kennel for profit, or an auto repair shop, flea market, etc.? They clarify they don't think anyone's advocating for those things, but would that, I guess, open that up to
So
other things?
the one comment I'll make to that is the difference is what's a commercial activity and what isn't. I don't believe that having a residence or having a second home and having that in a rental pool for periods of time when you're not using it by any stretch is a commercial activity. You know, people have in their neighborhoods every day the UPS truck that comes in and out of there because they're running an in-home business. Do you go and shut them down and make them become commercially zoned within a residential neighborhood because of it? No. Is the UPS truck, a FedEx truck every 5 minutes coming down the road a disruption? Yes. But they can do that based upon what they're doing. Obviously, dog kennels and other things are drastically different with commercial activities. One of the things that I've talked about in the work group and I've talked about with the realtors and others is, you know, do you make it to where somebody doesn't buy 15 of these places and run a mini hotel, avoiding the commercial zoning of it? And I think there's ways you can do that and police that to where you're not 100% like, you know, creating that commercial entity. And that's where I don't want to get, you know, you can get into the weeds on this, is discussing what the activity is or what the activity isn't. And obviously if somebody buys an 8-bedroom house and, you know, runs an 8-room hotel out of it, you have a whole different scenario there. And I think that there are rights of the locals to be able to, you know, stop certain obvious commercial activities, but just putting a house in a rental pool with certain, you know, restrictions that the locals come up with as far as licensing and occupancy or whatever, to me doesn't quite constitute the same as a commercial activity.
Looks like we got about 3 minutes left.
Yep. And I think Jennifer wanted to address that as well. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to add, you know, local government groups have kind of looked at that issue and thinking that there's got to be some kind of a day threshold that would possibly cross you over from, you know, renting your home a few times a year to make a little extra money versus a commercial activity. You know, right now we have kind of landed on just 14 days, which is only 2 weeks, but 7 weekends a year. It doesn't sound like a lot of time, but we really settled on that looking at the IRS requires that over 14 days, you have to start reporting that as rental income to the feds. And so that's a point where we have started trying to look at that, you know, where do you cross over into a commercial use? Not saying it's perfect, but that's where we're at right now.
And there was a question about the courts. It said that I'm sorry, Brian.
Oh, no, I was
Go
going to
ahead.
answer this question. Yeah.
Oh, you were going to ask the question. So it said that the short-term rental is not commercial, you know, is what Representative Shepherd is saying, but that the Michigan courts have ruled for decades, this attendee is saying that short-term rentals are in fact commercial.
Yeah, no, and that's at the heart of this issue, this discussion, I think, is right now we have a published Court of Appeals decision, and obviously we have something pending with the Supreme Court right now that Supervisor Nash is well acquainted with, that does discuss this distinction between commercial and residential activity. Our concern here is that the published Court of Appeals decision not only characterizes short-term rentals as commercial activity, but any rental activity that generates money, and that's an issue when you talk about the affordability question, which is long-term rentals and month-to-month rentals. So by virtue of that ruling, we have to start looking at the zoning implications there, which is to say you've got commercial activity occurring in a residential zone with a long-term lease. We're just mindful of the fact that the courts have had to grapple with this because there isn't guidance. And the fact that there's no legislative guidance or anything in the Zoning Enabling Act that defines what a short-term rental is, or quite frankly, commercial activity for residential purposes, that is something that we would like to see addressed through legislation. We understand, that this idea of a one-size-fits-all discussion, we're not going to get to the heart of it today, but at the same time, those types of things need to be addressed in a long-term and sort of universal way.
All right, thank you. That brings us to 3 o'clock, but if anyone else would like to weigh in on this one last topic before we go. All right, well, thank you all. Oh, I'm sorry. Supervisor Nash, did you want to weigh in?
Comment to go along with Jennifer's. In Spring Lake Township, short-term rentals end at 29 days. So if it's longer than that, that's the case. We do permit anybody 14 days now. We don't go 7 weekends, but and it's like Jennifer said, it's because of tax law. So it's not even with people that want to rent for a short term. As long as it's reasonable, we let that happen. So I mean, and I think if you look at at least the Western Michigan short-term rentals, they're all consistent like that. They permit short-term rentals some places. They permit a lot of short-term rentals for a short period of time. I mean, they're pretty flexible and responsive to different types of residents.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for your comments, for being here with us today. We appreciate you spending the time with Michigan Lakes and Streams Association. Dave, would you like to say a few words?
Well, I just want to thank everybody for, again, it's been, I think, a great webinar. Everybody's got lots of good points. It sounds like the parties are still talking to each other, as I think folks in Lansing do. You may be on opposite sides, but and sometimes you're on the very same side. I remember a thing called dark stores, and the realtors and all the municipalities got together, my biggest supporters. So, it's just a matter of trying to talk through this stuff. It's legislation. It doesn't just happen neat and clean sometimes. But, hopefully if there's a compromise, everybody can walk away and think that they got something from it and nobody's tremendously injured. But we'll keep our ears open for the Supreme Court decision on the Ream versus Spring Lake case. But again, it's nice to see 3 of you folks I used to see on a regular basis. So it's thank you very much for attending. Hopefully this has been a good session. And hopefully
you had to bring up dark stars, didn't you, Dave? Just had to bring up dark stars. Thanks for bringing that up. It's like just reopening the wound.
It's still open to me. So anyway, thank you very much. I'll let Melissa finish it up if she needs to. So
Yeah, so thank you for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend, all of you. To our attendees, if there were any questions that come up or if there was anything we didn't address, like I said, the contact information is available in the chat, and also some links to some relevant references that go with the discussion we had today. I will put all of that, as well as the recording of this webinar, on our website. So please check out our website, mymlsa.org. Join us. Subscribe to the Riparian Magazine. We like to address these topics that are important to lake and stream riparian owners. So thank you all for joining us, and have a really great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks.